I think what you're going to see a lot of is you're going to see a lot of new companies that didn't exist before building new things that weren't conceivable before in this space. And I think a lot of the existing companies are going to have a sort of not a hard time, but they're going to have to think through what their approach is going to be to enter the space in much the same way that companies were forced into the Web 2 space. And so when you look back at the companies that won Web 2 and that had these massive networks of massive ecosystems and so forth, most of them didn't exist in 1990s, maybe Google and Amazon, but other than that, like most of them didn't exist in the Web 1 world, so to speak. And so the question then you have to ask is what benefits, like you were saying before, can you get from something like this? And I think the benefits aren't necessarily what you think they're going to be. Like in the case of a lot of the companies that are trying to bring in blockchains internally, but they don't want the exposure of public data, like they'll go Hyperledger route. And you're getting the benefits of a blockchain, you're getting the benefits of something like Hyperledger, but you're not really getting the benefits of the Web3 ecosystem and the distributed computing and all of those elements. And so the question really becomes like, are you just doing it because you want the benefits of immutability, or is there something about your data? Is there something about what you're trying to build that is going to benefit from the ecosystem, from building smart contracts and having all this stuff publicly out there and available, that sort of thing. And that's going to be very hard for a lot of companies to determine. And so I think the easy route, especially for enterprise, is going to be the hyperledgers. It's going to be the private blockchains, but you don't really get the full benefit of the ecosystem when you go down that route.
I'm totally agreeing with you, Michael. I think I've talked to a few companies now that are trying to develop private blockchains and that sort of thing. And honestly, I think the business case is pretty weak there. It's just an extremely expensive, slow, annoying database that doesn't benefit from some of the network effects that you're getting out of the public blockchains. So what are you doing? Why are you doing this?
So Etienne mentioned getting sucked into Web3 against your will as like a defensive measure. I think it's important to recognize here, where is the pressure coming from to move to Web3? And it's not coming from Facebook. It's not coming from Google. This disrupts their business model of owning your data. Yeah, I don't anticipate these large players who exist to monetize your data are going to be making any like radical moves to Web3. It's the demand is coming from the user, right? The user is, I don't want to give away my information anymore. And I want to be able to own and monetize my own data, my own creations. So I think for CTOs, this is actually going to be about seeking out new user bases and who actually need Web3 technologies. And that's going to be content creators who want to monetize their data and monetize their creations better, get a better margin on the things that they create, and people like that. So I think there's just going to be new classes of applications that serve new classes of users, and that's where the shift is going to come from.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think a lot of people are talking about Web3 as though it's going to replace Web2, and I think that's a completely incorrect view. It's just at the margins, maybe it'll replace a few things, but it'll mostly just grow on top as an add-on, as capability that Web2 can't easily achieve, and it'll be a new thing. And so the idea of finding new users seems exactly right to me.
When you talk about privacy concerns, we're always talking about privacy concerns from the point of the user, but we don't talk about privacy concerns from the perspective of the company itself, the company that's building these tools on Web3. If you're building tools that you want like private data and storing data, and you're using it as a database, you have to remember that it's not just the user's privacy concerns that you have to be worried, it's your own. And you don't have the privacy that you would have if it were just your local stored database and that sort of thing. And you do have some coins out there like that, Zcash, Monero, that sort of do the privacy bit, but they do it almost like a shell game, right? Like Monero is a little bit of a shell game and how it handles privacy. Zcash probably does it the best just in terms of the whole 2 out, 1 in situation. But all of that stuff could eventually be retrograde. Like you can figure that information out. And so when you're talking about privacy from a corporate perspective, you're not just looking at your user's privacy in terms of their information and things attached to their wallet, but you're looking at your own corporate information and your competitors having access to it. And your competitors investing lots of money into figuring out what you're doing and how you're doing it, and being able to maybe reverse engineer what you're doing based off of the metadata that's in the chain and that sort of thing. So there's a whole plethora of things that you have to think about.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one of the keys to thinking about blockchain as a database is to understand that by default and with only extremely complex efforts will you avoid it being public, like all the information in that database being public. And so if you have data that wants to be public and needs to be public, this idea of write once, read many or something like that, then I think it can be a good solution.
So can I riff a little bit on the user owns their data? Is it data that's encrypted in the blockchain with my private key? Is that what it means?
Private data transactions, basically. Like you take your wallet with you wherever you go. You interact with whatever app you choose to interact with. But at the end of the day, like that information is associated to your wallet, associated to you. It's not necessarily associated to the company.
So in other words, if I'm a company that is fully Web3 and I have this gorgeous product, I am basically through your wallet asking you for permission to access your data, which without your decryption of your data on the blockchain, I will not have access to that. Does that sound right?
That's pretty good in terms of approximation. I don't think anyone's cracked that chain yet in terms of like how to do that successfully from outside of the financial space, right? Outside of monetarily financial, like I'm giving you X amount of tokens, you're giving me X amount of information or ETH or whatever the case is. Like most of that kind of stuff has happened within a financial sense.
Okay, but so my first flaw in this system is my ownership of my data is only as good as my recollection and safety of my private key or my wallet.
Yes.
This is the incredibly big challenge is if there's anything CTOs have learned, it's that people are terrible about passwords, about security, about anything.
But then it's not just, can I not lose my wallet? It's the fact that I can have multiple wallets. I feel like the human wants to own their data and having a very small, like already from the population, you have a very small group of people who understand what a wallet is. And of that very small group of people, some of them are accidentally throwing out their hard drives into landfills. I just think that it's really asking a lot of the user to be able to keep their data not only accessible to the company that wants to add value to it.
I don't think you're going to have to work hard to find the soft underbelly of Web3 as it exists now. As Augustin said, it's the worst database you'll ever use at this point. Running your application on the EVM, you're not going to be a happy camper if you're used to running applications in a commercial public cloud. We have a long way to go, and there are some thorny computer science problems to solve before we're going to be able to rebuild Facebook on Web3. But I think the most important aspect of Web3 is why it's happening, right? We're not using blockchain to build distributed databases because the databases that we have aren't performant enough. The problem is that we want to have networks of public trust that don't have anything to do with these centralized authorities. So we'll find out if the juice is worth the squeeze once we invest all of these resources into building these platforms, will we?
I think the users will come with these platforms as they come. Like, how hard was it to convince your grandma not to write her password on her sticky and put it up on her monitor, right? Like, that's a problem that we've had for almost 30 years. And it still happens and people still do it. And so the security implications of somebody having these long 18-word passwords that they have to remember just to be able to initialize their wallets. And then they use their wallets on their phones. They use their wallets on their computers. They forget where those 18 words are. They don't put them in a safe. They leave them in a drawer, and suddenly they can't get into their wallet again, and they can't get that back. That sort of thing. Like those are the same sort of pain points that I can see that I saw with just password remembrance, 26 character passwords that nobody can remember, and they just write down on a notebook, that sort of thing. I think the pain points are the same, in my opinion. For what we've gone through that pain point already, and we're going to have to go through this pain point as well.
Yeah, obviously what Michael's saying is exactly right. I think the challenge, of course, is that a lot of we'll call it the hype or the boosterism around Web3 is this idea of decentralizing things, quote unquote, and not giving Facebook or Google your data. There's a reason that I use Gmail, and it's because Gmail does an awful lot of good things for me so that I don't have to run my own private mail server, because that would be a complete nightmare. And so it introduces new problems Now, not to be too negative about it, because it introduces significantly new opportunities. It's just a question of being really clear-eyed about what the upsides of those new opportunities are. I think the idea of putting your database in on the blockchain, that's obviously insane, but like tiny important pieces like identity and that sort of thing, I mean, that's probably pretty sane, maybe.
Yeah, I'm thinking through the idea that the world that Web3 wants to be the foundation of is the world that doesn't exist in the real world. So I feel if you think about NFT being a frenzied proof of ownership of a digital asset, right? If you think of self-sovereign identities, which was so big 5 years ago on the blockchain, where it was so important to have an identity that could be mapped to me. If you think about the different technologies, if there's a confluence of Web3 is actually like trying to be the metaverses or there's a world that doesn't exist in flesh and bone that has to be the metaverse as maybe one expression of that, then I can understand how the complete immutability of it, in other words, just like I can't take this hand and put it on someone else's body, my hand is immutable, right? It can't be taken off my body. How does that get replicated in the metaverse? Well, through a blockchainy, immutably connected CPU thingy. If I purchase this coffee mug and it's mine and it's only mine, and how does that get replicated in this is immutable. I suppose I can throw it on the floor and it breaks. But so there's this replication of the real world into the metaverse that now I'm starting to say, wow, okay, Web3 is actually the web, is the internet of the world that doesn't exist and hasn't been created yet. And we have seen faint glimmers of. That's where I'm going with this right now.
I think you hit the nail on the head at this whole world that Web3 is supposed to enable just doesn't exist yet. We talk about decentralized finance like nation states are just going to allow that to happen. We talk about having a social network built on Web3 and so there's no middleman to take rents, which is what Facebook does. And that Facebook and Google are just going to lie down and allow this to happen. You've mentioned a number of technological challenges that Web3 faces in becoming a reality. We can think of those all day, but there are also tons of regulatory and also just societal barriers to making it happen.